I attend a small liberal arts college in central VA, and I'm part of the anthropology program there. Our program does yearly excavations as part of a field school. And for the past 15-20 years or so, we have been working on the same site in a state park. With such a permanent excavation, our department chair went ahead and bought a little house in a nearby town for us to live in for the month the school runs. The house had been vacant for 3 or so years before we started renting it, and the owner disclosed to our director, we'll call him Ron, that there had been a murder or suicide at the house by the previous owners. The father, an alcoholic who worked for the local power plant, had been laid off and came home in a rage. He shot his wife once in the house before she ran to the driveway where he finished her off. Next, he pulled his daughters out of the house and shot them on the fringe of the woods that circle the property. He then went inside and shot himself. Ron didn't think much of this, but chose not to tell anyone else of the house's sad history. A few weeks into that year's field school, several guys went out around 3 in the morning to use the porta-johns on the edge of camp. About halfway through their business, they started to hear what they described as giggling coming from the woods beyond the bathrooms. They freaked and hightailed it back to their bunks. They told Ron about it the next morning, and he assumed they were just pulling his chain and let it go. A few weeks later, Ron was at the station by himself for a night, organizing supplies before the new excavation started. The house has no AC, so windows are open all the time. And through the open window, he started to hear what he said could only be described as children's voices coming through the window. He was startled, but stuck it out, and the voices eventually stopped. He packed up the next day as planned, and left the field station empty until the next summer. That summer, he decided to really explore the house a little. It is a small house, but there was a crawl space up at the top of the stairs. He and some students opened the crawl space and found a small journal stashed in the back. They began to read sections, and found that it was the diary of the oldest of the 2 girls who had been murdered by their father. The last entry was half finished and panicked, as if the girl had been pulled out of the crawl space as she was writing. They decided to burn the journal and did not think any more of it. A few years later, a graduate of the program, we'll call him Mason, was using a nearby site as part of his master's thesis, so he and a buddy planned to set up camp at the field house for a few days. His friend was delayed in getting there, so Mason spent the first night camped out alone. He was aware of the stories, but had done many seasons of field work at the house and hadn't ever had any issues. He didn't use the house itself and just set up camp outside where we have a fire pit set up. It was a chilly night, so he parked his truck on one side of the fire to reflect heat and sat facing away from the house. He sat peacefully for a while, but all of a sudden noticed a change in the light. He turned to face the house and saw that a light had come on in the upstairs window, and there was a dark figure standing there, looking out at him. He didn't pack any of his stuff, didn't even put out the fire. He just got in his truck and noped the fuck out of there. He went to the nearest town, bought all new gear, and checked into a hotel until his buddy finally arrived 2 days later. He still comes back every year for field work, but he is always beyond paranoid and refuses to sleep in the house. Up until this point, I have been recounting stories I have heard firsthand, but have never been present for or experienced. Now, however, we have gotten to the point when I attended the field school for the first time. Field school lasts a month, and all of the following happened within the month that I was there. Most revolve around one guy, Morgan. So Morgan was sleeping in the boys' bunk one night, next to a window that faces the bathhouse. The lights in the bathhouse were left on all night, so he could see fairly well. All of a sudden, the dark figure of a man passed by the window. He looked around, but all of the men in camp were accounted for within the bunk. He's a pretty chill dude, so he was just like, fuck that, and turned over and went back to sleep. Never looked out the window at night again, though. A week or so later, the same guy, Morgan, was up late in the common area near the fire pit, working on some assignments that he had been procrastinating on. He was sitting at a table, facing the house with his back to the woods. It was about 2 a.m. and everyone else in camp had been asleep for at least an hour. All of a sudden, he heard a jingling noise behind him, like keys that were being jostled together. He didn't like it, but chose to ignore it and hoped it was nothing. He kept working for another few minutes, when from the same spot behind him, he heard a massive crash. Without turning around, he vaulted over the table and sprinted to his bunk, never once looked back. On the last day, we were all cleaning the house, preparing to lock it up for the year. Everyone in camp had been assigned a different task, and one of my friends, called Hannah, had been assigned to sweep the upstairs of the house, while I had been assigned to sweep the downstairs. She put her headphones in and went to it. A few minutes into my sweeping, Hannah comes charging down the stairs, screaming. She didn't stop when she saw me, just ran straight out the door and into the yard. Alarmed, I followed her and found her sitting in the yard crying hysterically. When she finally calmed down enough to talk, she told me she had been facing the wall, sweeping, and had felt someone tug on the back of her shirt, assuming it was me coming to tell her something. She turned around to find no one there. That was when she lost it and came running down the stairs. Those are all the biggest stories from the house, not including littler things like weird floating lights and endless whispering from the woods. Every time I stay at my grandma's house, I hear someone walking upstairs. It starts at one side of the room, casually walks to the other, and stops. This happens maybe twice a night. I didn't start hearing it until I was about 14, when my grandparents made me start sleeping in a different room on the first floor because they started sleeping in separate bedrooms. Blah, blah, blah. Regardless, both of their rooms are also on the first floor. For a little backstory, I've always been afraid of the upstairs at their house. I don't know why, but it has always freaked me out, and I refuse to ever go up there alone. There's one room specifically, though. It's a long, narrow bedroom. When you open the door, there are closets on your left and right, a bed placed roughly in the middle of the room, and a window on the far side opposite the door. I was told growing up by my grandparents that the sons of the previous owner claimed to see a gorilla come out of the closet at night, dance around the room, and go back into the closet. I thought nothing of this story until I had to start sleeping in the other room, the room located directly below the scary room upstairs. So, we all go to bed. All the lights in the house are off, and I'm still awake, lying on the bed. Then I heard it. Thump, 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 starting at one end of the room upstairs. It got closer to me, passed right above me, and continued to the end of the room, where it stopped. I was wide awake, terrified out of my mind. There was no question to me that I had heard footsteps. I knew that slow, casual pace. I was freaked out and went to my grandpa's room. I told him what I heard. He told me that the house is old and it creaks, but he turned the dining room light on for me, so I felt a little safer. I tried going back to sleep. Then it started again, this time from where it ended the first time, by the window upstairs. It walked over me again and stopped when it reached the door. I thought it was over until 5 seconds later when I heard it coming down the stairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Silence as it reached the landing. Then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and silence again as it reached the first floor. I was frozen in shock. Whatever it was on my floor of the house, and sadly unaffected by the dining room light. I was staring at the doorway to my room. The dining room light was shining in, and my vision began to distort. I felt dizzy with fear, so I pulled the blankets over my head and suddenly heard a scratching sound from inside my room. I knew exactly where it was coming from. 2, my grandpa's gun case. It was a very obvious sound, scratching on the wood, long scratches down the front of the gun case door. I could even hear the door ever so slightly tapping against the frame as each scratch began. I tried to scream, and I couldn't. I took a second to take a deep breath and let out a loud scream. In seconds, my grandpa had made it to my room, and I was relieved. Needless to say, he still didn't believe me. So I did what any normal person would do. I draped a sheet over the side of the bed and slept underneath it. I wrapped myself tightly in a comforter, put on headphones, and turned my back to the door. There could be a party of ghosts in my room, and I wouldn't even know. The next morning, my grandpa told my grandma about what happened the night before. She said, "Oh, that's silly. You know, your cousin woke me up the last time she stayed here. She came into my room saying, 'I hear footsteps.' I slept under the bed for the rest of my week stay with them. I've stayed there countless times since that happened, and I hear the footsteps every time. I sleep on top of the bed now, but keep my back to the door and sleep with headphones on. I haven't heard it come down the stairs since that first night. But if it does, I don't want to know. I worked overnight security at a convention center for a few years. One night at like 2 a.m., I was on cameras chit-chatting with another officer who was manned at what we called base. I had 2 other guys and my supervisor out on patrol. I saw a homeless dude go up our outdoor elevator to a public terrace and was keeping an eye on him. No big deal. He goes to a corner just out of reach of our cameras, a corner known to us for people to usually catch a quick nap in. I call on the radio to our nearest patrol officer, whom was also patrolling with my supervisor, that this guy was hanging out here doing whatever. They casually start walking towards the area. Upon their arrival to the scene, next thing I know, on another camera directly below this terrace corner, like 50 feet below, also right outside our office, I see a body drop straight down and land on their legs, collapsing to the ground. I quickly stand up from my chair and am panicking. Holy shit, holy shit, holy shit. I grab the first aid kit and run out of the office to go outside. My other officer on base jumps on the phone and calls 911. My supervisor says, "Base, call 911." We're already on it. I'm the first one there, and this homeless man was writhing in pain. Shattered bones protruding from his ankles, bleeding from the mouth. Trying to mumble what happened. He manages to roll over, and I see his hands are also fucked up. More bones protruding from his wrists. I don't dare touch him, and I doubted my first aid kit would have helped at all. My supervisor and other officer come running down the stairs to the scene. Apparently, when they arrived to the original scene on the terrace in my camera's blind spot, the guy was sitting on the ledge with the 50-foot drop directly below him. My supervisor yells, "Hey, get down from there!" And the homeless dude just lifts himself up and drops. Not a word spoken. First responders arrive and take him to the hospital. I, of course, had to write the report and review the video of the incident. A cop comes an hour later and shares his condition that he survived, but will most likely never walk again. No major internal organ damage. Now for the major coincidence. A few days later, I get a new roommate who brings his girlfriend over. We're all hanging out, talking, drinking. I share that I work security at so-and-so, and the new roommate's girlfriend says, "Oh, didn't you guys just have a homeless man fall off your terrace and almost die?" Thief! How'd she know that? There was no media coverage. She wasn't there. Apparently she was the godmother of his children, best friends with the mother. She shares that he was a homeless alcoholic junkie that constantly fought with the police and was in and out of jail multiple times. She got the call that he attempted suicide and rushed with the mother to the hospital to see him. She shared his conditions with me and that he was in critical condition but expected to survive. Her and my roommate shortly broke up, and I never saw her again. A simple job. That is what I thought it would be. Just helping out some kids during summertime with all the camping activities. Good, wholesome fun, and a feeling of pride in being a small, special part of the summertime fun that all the kids would remember when they were my age. I never got to go to summer camp, so I thought it would be nice to experience all the entertainment and memories alongside a new generation. I was sure everyone would have a great time. That is, until the killing started. I still feel guilty that I survived when so many were slain.
I could have done more. I should have done more.
I don't know how or why it all happened. When it was done, I couldn't believe what had happened or who the police said was the perpetrator. The trauma and fear of the situation will stay with me forever, but at least I survived. My friends and campers did not. I will recount what I remembered to honor their memory and make me face my own failure to protect them. I know I could have done more, but if it was really who I suspect it was, would I have been able to stop them? It was the first week of summer, and I was headed to Camp Greenleaf with the other counselors. The day was beautiful, and the scenic vista of the camp and the nearby lake glistening in the morning light was an inspiring sight. With me were 3 other counselors, Chelsea, Glenn, and Whitney. They all looked right out of high school, and I was the oldest by a bit, it seemed. Whitney had been sitting next to me on the bus, so I tried to talk with her a bit, but she seemed disinterested and was mostly on her phone the whole time. Meanwhile, Glenn was making an awkward attempt at hitting on Chelsea, who continued to roll her eyes and try to ignore his attempts at small talk. Despite the disinterest of my fellow counselors, I was ready to get started. We got off the bus and were met by a bear of a man who gave us a brief introduction and overview on what to expect in our roles as camp counselors. The man leading the meeting was the director and head of Camp Greenleaf, Mr. Johnston, though he insisted we refer to him as Ken,
Or coach.
since he also worked as a high school football coach during the school year. Remember, we are a team. We work together and we do our best, and everyone will have a great summer. He finished with a flourish and a raised fist, like he expected us to give him a standing ovation. I felt bad at the lack of response, so I shouted a response. Yeah, let's do it. Ken smiled approvingly, while my fellow counselors judged me in silence with condescending looks. This was going to be rough if I had to remain the only optimistic one besides the director. Later that day, the campers arrived. We were a bit short, considering we were supposed to have over 20 kids, but only 12 arrived. Apparently, the camp had a reputation that some kids had heard disturbing rumors about and refused to go. It seemed like a bad omen, but I promised I would help make the time for the kids who did show as great as possible. I got to meet most of the campers, and despite being discouraged by the small number, it did mean we had more time to spend with each one. My excitement was diluted when I realized a lot of them seemed uninterested in most of what the camp and all of us had to offer. The general apathy as soon as they arrived was palpable. They were high schoolers, and to my dismay, seemed more inclined to ignore our attempts at instruction and activities and stay glued to their phones. Only one of the campers spoke directly to us. Her name was Beatrice, or B for short. She was a little shy, though seemed nice. Unfortunately, she was a bit of a pariah and was picked on by most of the other kids. The only thing that could pull their attention away from their phones was a verbal jab or some trick or prank they tried to pull at B's expense. I tried to put a stop to it, but it was always in passive-aggressive ways that were tough or catch and call out the offenders. Most of the girls ignored me anyway and continued to harass B throughout the day. We had a very busy day of activities and orientation. Many of the kids did start to have fun when they realized they had a lot more to do than just sit around on social media. Glenn and I showed the boys to their cabins, while Whitney and Chelsea showed the girls to theirs. Even as we parted into our groups, I saw Beatrice looking sullen, and I saw more of the girls snickering at her behind her back. It was tough to watch, but I couldn't do much to interfere. Later at night, Ken had arranged a counselor meeting, and he seemed very odd. He was normally very cheery, practically dripping with enthusiasm. Now though, despite arranging the meeting, he seemed disinterested and almost paranoid. It seemed like he kept looking over his shoulder, and at several points had even asked us, "Do you all hear that? That chiming sound in the distance?" We all listened carefully, but none of us could. I can go take a look and see if some of the kids left their cabins and are messing around with some of the trinkets in the storage shed. I know there was an old cowbell out there. Glenn interrupted me quickly, saying, "I got a fever, and that's the only prescription is more cowbell," in a terrible Christopher Walken impression. I laughed despite the interruption. Whitney and Chelsea either didn't get it or didn't care, while Ken glowered at it. We sat back down, and Ken muttered again, "I hear something out there. Someone is messing with me." We sat in awkward silence for a bit longer, until he told us we could leave, without even discussing tomorrow's agenda, which had been the whole reason for the meeting. We all thought it was very strange, but we started for the door. On the way, I thought I saw Ken moving towards a cabinet, and I heard the clinking of glass bottles. On the way out, I tried to talk to Whitney and Chelsea about B and the girls bullying her. They seemed distracted by how Ken was acting and brushed me off, saying they would take care of it, though I was not sure if they had really heard me. I gave up the attempt and returned to my cabin. Wasting no time, I put the light out and fell asleep. I don't know how long I was out, but I remember being awoken by an odd chiming sound in the night. It was faint, not so loud that it woke everyone up, but noticeable to those who were light sleepers. Hadn't Ken said he heard a bell or chime or something? I saw a few lights come on in the boys' cabin and figured a few campers had heard the sound too. I almost wrote it off and was about to go back to sleep when there was a tortured scream heard from the director's cabin. I got up and rushed over to check it out. I was not alone in hearing the sound, and Whitney and Glenn waited with the few campers who were awakened by the commotion, while Chelsea and I went to look inside. It was a bad scene, and we couldn't find Ken anywhere. The cabin had been thrashed, and it looked like a bear had gone through it. The walls were shredded and the furniture smashed. There was no sign of him. I saw a few bottles on the ground near his chair and thought maybe this was some sort of weird drunken outburst, and maybe he had left to clear his head. That did not explain the terrible damage to the cabin, though. That drunk bastard left us alone with these kids. "What an asshole!" Chelsea blurted out, letting her real feelings be known. "Yeah, I don't know what the hell is going on, but it's not good," I responded. We were almost ready to leave empty-handed, but I noticed something strange near the desk. It was an odd little black box that upon closer inspection had been slightly opened. Inside was a soft padded interior and a recess that looked like it was made for some type of mask. This was really strange. Neither of us knew what the significance was, but I didn't like the chill I felt when I held the box. I could swear I heard an ethereal chime in the distance that beckoned me. Chelsea looked at me, confused and upset. I realized I had been holding the box, staring off into space. "Are we leaving or what?" she demanded. I shook my head and came out of the daze and responded, "Sorry, not sure what came over me. Let's go tell the others that Ken's gone." Back outside, we meet up with Whitney and Glenn to tell them the news. They were annoyed but not as surprised. Since Glenn had known about Ken's drinking and had even said he would sometimes take random breaks for super long periods of time. He must have figured he was out getting hammered somewhere right now, but I was not so sure. If he was drunk, why wreck his whole office? Why leave in the middle of the night and not finish all his booze here for that matter? None of this felt right. As we considered the problem at hand, we heard a shrill scream from the girls' cabin. Whitney and Chelsea rushed ahead, concern plain on their faces since they had left their wards unattended to look into the matter of the disappearing director. We rushed on and saw the girls had all left the cabin and were standing outside, panicking and screaming. As we got closer, I asked one of them just what had happened, and the only girl who had her wits still intact said that someone killed them. She was horrified like her friends, but still seemed cogent, so I asked her if she saw what happened. A big man, with a creepy mask. He had a weird chime when he stepped. Was holding an axe. He, and she tapered off into sobbing. I tried to comfort her, but it was a bad scene. Other girls had similar accounts. They said someone or something had killed their friends. Glenn tapped me on the shoulder just then and told me that some of the girls said they had seen a large man exit the cabin shortly before the other girls woke up and saw their murdered friends. I heard another scream and saw Chelsea and Whitney emerge from the girls' cabin, ghost white. Chelsea looked dazed and Whitney threw up. "Grace and Sasha are dead," Chelsea muttered, barely able to parse the words through obvious shock and horror. Glenn was trying to comfort Whitney, who was trying to recover. I raised my voice and quickly asserted that we need to call the police now. We need to get everyone together in the rec center and lock the doors. Has anyone seen Ken? There was an awkward pause and looks back and forth to see if anyone had. Chelsea spoke up again. "He got drunk, wrecked his office, and now 2 kids are dead. I don't think we should rule out that he may have been responsible for this," she said with a grim look accompanying the heavy accusation. "Whoa, wait. You think Ken would kill kids? Why would he do that? He has run this camp for 20 years. How and why would he do that?" I asked with shocked disbelief. My tone disguised the slowly creeping feeling of acceptance in Chelsea's reasoning. I hated to believe it, but maybe she was right, and he had just snapped. Before we could get into a back and forth about Ken and his motives, there was a horrible flash and explosion, and the boys' cabin burst into flames. We raced over to find a raging fire where the cabin had been. A fiery explosion had engulfed it, and to my dawning horror, I realized the boys had still been in there. We hadn't had a chance to bring everyone to the rec cabin like we planned. I clutched my head in my hands and gawked at the horror of the situation when I saw movement near the flaming ruin. It was a tall figure shuffling forward and murmuring something. I thought it was Jacob, one of the taller kids. Then I realized he was too large. I stopped moving forward and stared in disbelief when I saw it was someone else. He was burned by the flames and had what appeared to be charred blood on his hands and shirt.
He held a wood-cutting axe in both hands and had a horrible pallid mask on.
That had a small chime connected to the top, like the bobber on an anglerfish. It tinkled when he stomped forward, providing a jarring discordance with the huge figure's thundering footsteps. Glenn stepped forward, brandishing an oar from the canoes, and in a quavering voice told the figure to back off. "I'm warning you, man, leave us alone." He swung the oar back and forth to illustrate the point. The masked man stopped moving and fell to his knees, clutching his head and letting out a pained scream. Through gritted teeth, we heard the words in an all too familiar voice. "Help me, Glenn. Help." We all realized that voice was Ken's. Had he snapped after all? Glenn realized it was the director and moved forward cautiously. Ken was sobbing now, his arms outstretched. Glenn got closer and asked, "Mr. Johnston, what happened? What did you do?" Before any of us could blink, Ken grabbed Glenn's arm and stuttered out, You all need to leave now. That sound. I can't stop myself. I can't. And his body went momentarily inert like a marionette with its strings cut. Before Glenn could even whisper a response, Ken sat bolt upright and seized Glenn by the throat and lifted him up. Then he threw him into the side of the burning cabin. Glenn screamed as the flames licked at his clothes, and before any of us could move in to help Mr. Johnston had raised the axe and embedded it into Glenn's head with a wet crunch. All of us screamed in unison at the cold-blooded murder we had just witnessed. There was another awful ripping sound as the axe came free from Glenn's lifeless body, and the soulless eyes of the director turned murderer faced us. Whitney and Chelsea screamed and ran, and I also turned to flee. I remember seeing Beatrice standing outside the girls' cabin looking at the spectacle. I ran towards her and implored her to get back inside and lock the doors, but she just gently smiled and shook her head and pointed to me. I was confused by the gesture, but I thought I had heard the faint sound of a bell and saw something in her other hand. I ran towards her, but something struck me hard in the back of the head and everything went dark. I woke up hours later in the girls' cabin. Beatrice was the only one there with me. She said the others had all been killed. The way she said it was oddly calm and dispassionate. Later, the police arrived, and it was determined the perpetrator of the terrible killings had been Ken Johnston. Drunk and driven into a homicidal rage, he had killed almost every single camper and all the counselors but me. Police found him outside the cabins face down and soaked in blood, surrounded by more corpses. Found on his person was a gore-encrusted woodcutting axe and an odd mask with a chime on it. Later, I heard that he insisted in his insanity plea that the mask made me do it. It spoke to me. Ken was later found guilty and sentenced to execution. During the trial, it was discovered that he did have a real dark side to him. Evidence turned up that he had abused several campers in the past and paid them off or had threatened them to stay quiet. One case around 16 years ago stated he had raped a camper and she had even gotten pregnant. Somehow, he had kept it under wraps and had paid the mother to keep quiet. The disturbing thing is that the mother had died recently, and the name of the surviving child was one Beatrice Larkin. I considered the only other survivor from that horrible night and thought about the implications. She was the right age, and at the camp he worked at no less. Then I remembered the odd chiming sound, and the hint of a memory replayed in my head of her holding a small bell and hearing it chime in tune with the disturbing mask's chime and the bellows of pain and forced motion of Mr. Johnston as he was moved in time with the chiming sound. What the hell was that bell, and what was it really doing? I don't know what really happened, though I suspect some impossible things. I never saw her again, but if my creeping suspicion is confirmed, then they might not have stopped the right person, and a killer is still on the loose.